If there's one thing Metallica's known for, besides blistering riffs, iconic stage antics, and Lars's sometimes questionable drum fills, it's their ability to make waves in the music industry. But in the early 2000s, the waves they were making were more drowning in bad decisions kind of legendary than mosh pit glory kind. Metallica went from arena gods to internet villains, lost a bass player, and somehow ended up with Bob Rock awkwardly plunking away on the bass, all while recording one of the most contentious albums of their career, Saint Anger.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
In April 2000, Metallica made a move that would forever cement their place in the What Not to Do Hall of Fame for rock bands. They sued Napster. At the time, Napster was the rebellious pirate ship of the internet, sailing the high seas of file sharing, and every teenager with a dial-up connection was ready to jump aboard. Napster was more than a software. It was a revolution that signaled a new era where music was no longer bound by CDs and MTV. And Metallica, well, they tried to sink that ship. Lars Ulrich led the charge, accusing the service of copyright infringement. But instead of a calculated strike against piracy, it looked more like a rich rock band punching down at their own fans at the time. Pretty much overnight, Metallica went from legendary rebels to the establishment. Fans didn't just boo from the sidelines, they revolted. And the backlash was instantaneous. College students, Metallica's core demographic, who had once filled stadiums to scream along to Enter Sandman, now saw the band as sellouts, more concerned with their bottom line than the fans who had built them up. Websites popped up mocking Lars with animations of him chasing money, while fans boycotted the band in a way that seemed like poetic justice, by pirating some of their music, of course. And by this point in Metallica's history, their brand was less about killer riffs and more about courtroom dramas and sour grapes. By 2001, Metallica knew they needed to pivot, and fast. The load-reload era had already divided fans with its sudden change in image and sound, but now they're at the risk of alienating what little goodwill remained. The plan? Write some new music, get back to their roots, and remind the world why Metallica was still the biggest name in heavy metal. But it didn't take long for things to unravel. In January of 2001, the band headed back to the studio, hoping to recapture the magic, or at least stop the hemorrhaging. Yet this wasn't the same Metallica that had conquered the 80s with Master of Puppets and Justice for All. This was a band hanging on by a thread, fraying at every edge. James Hetfield was struggling with addiction, and the band's interpersonal relationships were strained to the breaking point. They weren't just dealing with creative challenges, they were trying to keep the whole ship from sinking. And then we have Jason Newsted, Metallica's bassist since the tragic death of Cliff Burton in 1986. Newsted was brought in to fill the massive void left by Cliff, but it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. Imagine joining the world's biggest metal band only to be treated like the new kid who wasn't invited to the lunch table. His bass lines were buried so deep in And Justice for All that fans joked that you needed a metal detector to find them. It was clear from day one, Newsted wasn't just replacing a bass player, he was trying to replace a brother, and Metallica was having none of it. From endless hazing to outright sabotage, Newsted endured more abuse than any band member should. His equipment was often tampered with, he was ridiculed for his side projects, and even his suggestions for the band's direction were dismissed faster than Lars Ulrich could say no bass in the mix. Jason wasn't just an outsider, he was a scapegoat for the band that never really fully dealt with their trauma. And let's not forget, the members of Metallica were practically allergic to any mention of side projects. When Newsted dared to suggest that he'd like to explore his own musical interests, James and Lars pounced on him like he just proposed burning the Metallica logo. Despite years of relentless touring, recording, and, let's be honest, being pushed around by the other members, Newsted was still the band's punching bag, often quite literally. And by the time the 2000s rolled around, the cracks were more than visible. They were gaping. Newsted was just getting worn down, both physically and mentally. So after years of putting up with all this nonsense, Jason Newsted was done. He had spent nearly 15 years trying to earn his place in a band that never really fully accepted him, and he was ready to move on. He wanted to explore his side project, Echo Brain, which shockingly showed he could write and perform music that didn't revolve around another band. Echo Brain's sound is fresh, experimental, and most importantly, it was Jason. But when Hetfield got wind of it, he wasn't pleased. He saw Newsted's desire to do something outside of Metallica as a betrayal, famously stating that Jason's dedication to another band would dilute Metallica's brand. Newsted wasn't asking for much, just a bit of creative freedom and respect. Instead, he got an ultimatum. Be Metallica's bass player or be your own musician, but you cannot be both. So Newsted split, and it was a move that left fans shocked but hardly surprised. For Jason Newsted, it was freedom at last. For Metallica, it was one more piece of their crumbling empire falling away. So now Metallica is left in a precarious position. No bass player and a ton of unresolved tension. Newsted's exit wasn't just a personal change, it was a glaring symptom of a band teetering on the edge of collapse. James Hetfield was spiraling in his own personal struggles. Lars Ulrich was still furious at the world and everybody in it. And Hammett was caught in the crossfire, trying to keep peace like a reluctant middle child in a dysfunctional family. The remaining members were forced to confront their own demons. With no immediate replacement in sight, and auditioning a new bassist feeling as appealing as diving headfirst in a swimming pool full of broken glass, Metallica turned to one person who'd been a fixture in the studio life for years, Bob Rock. This was the Bob Rock who had produced the Black Album, transforming Metallica into a household name, and now he had to awkwardly step in with a bass guitar player. Bob Rock had spent years behind the mixing desk and definitely had his hand in sculpting their sound, but having him step in as a bass player was more like a Hail Mary, if there ever was one. And Bob's stint on the bass wasn't just a stopgap. It was a neon sign flashing help wanted. Metallica wasn't just short a bass player. They were short on trust, camaraderie, and frankly, any sense of direction. Rock's involvement was less about finding a perfect musical fit and more about holding the band together with duct tape and good intention. He had become part babysitter, part band member, and full-time witness to one of the most dysfunctional recording sessions in rock history. And these sessions became infamous for their chaos, emotional breakdowns, screaming matches, and the overwhelming sense that nobody really wanted to be there, but nobody wanted to quit either. The band decided that they needed therapy, so they brought in Phil Towley to help them work through their issues while recording Saint Anger. Towley's job was to navigate the emotional minefield that was Metallica's psyche at the time, which usually involved mediating petty arguments, offering up self-help slogans, and basically acting as a chaperone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. As the band moved forward without Newsted, the cracks in the foundation were impossible to ignore, and the process of recording Saint Anger was anything but smooth. They set up shop in a makeshift army barracks on the Presidio of San Francisco because their main studio wasn't ready yet. Before Hetfield entered rehab, the band started working on material like Frantic and Saint Anger, going for that more of a raw, aggressive sound that matched the band's collective mood at the time. However, quickly the sessions ground to a halt in July 2001 when James was grappling with severe alcoholism and personal demons, ended up checking himself into rehab, leaving the rest of the band in limbo. During that time, Kirk and Lars both found themselves kind of stuck in a holding pattern, and the sessions would resume again once Hetfield returned in December 2001, but even then it wasn't smooth sailing. James Hetfield's strict new work hours, limited to noon to 4 p.m., were meant to accommodate his newfound sobriety, but they clashed with the usual all-night jam sessions Metallica was accustomed to. And this added a layer of tension, particularly between James and Lars, who frequently listened to tracks outside of these designated hours, sparking arguments that boiled into infamous shouting matches documented on Some Kind of Monster. So recording had resumed at Metallica's new studio, HQ in San Rafael, California, but the dynamics had drastically changed by that time. And this is where Towley stepped in, the personal enhancement coach turned band mediator, whose presence felt more like a plot twist from a bad reality TV show than any real solution. He was supposed to help the band mend their fractured relationships, but Towley's touchy-feely approach, asking James how certain riffs made him feel, only seemed to amplify the already high tensions. Nevertheless, the sessions went on, with songs written on the fly, riffs cobbled together hastily, vocal takes that captured Hetfield's emotional rawness, often without the polish of earlier albums. And Hetfield's lyrics were as confessional as they were awkward, sometimes sounding more like pages torn from a therapy notebook than the powerhouse metal anthems fans expected. But yet the most infamous aspect of the album is yet to come in this story. The most talked about aspect of Saint Anger was its sound, specifically the snare drum that would go down in history as one of the most divisive sonic choices in rock music. Lars Ulrich's snare, often described as sounding like a trash can lid being hit with a baseball bat, wasn't just a production choice. It was a statement. It was a bold, ear-splitting screw you to conventional drumming that left fans either scratching their heads or desperately searching for earplugs. During a jam session, Lars had simply forgot to turn on the snare wires, leaving that drum with that hollow ring-like echo that sounds like someone dropped a toolbox from a flight of stairs. And instead of thinking, well, maybe we should fix that, Lars decided, yes, this is exactly what St. Anger needs. Lars became very defensive about the sound, claiming it was the band's truth of that moment. Because nothing says emotional honesty like the sound of an unhinged washing machine. Meanwhile, Bob Rock, the fearless producer, doubled down, explaining that they were going for a garage band vibe, and this snare sound was integral to that raw, unfiltered feel that they were desperately chasing. And Rock even went further, insisting that this bizarre choice actually helped keep the band together, like some magical anti-snare therapy session that no one asked for. It was quite literally throwing the rule book out the window and stomping on it for good measure. So now Lars Ulrich fans were reeling, but what about the guitar fans who were all into Kirk's stuff? Well, they ditched the guitar solos, because who needs those in a Metallica album? So apparently the idea was to capture the sound of these four guys jamming in a room, even if that room happened to sound like a cluttered garage with acoustics straight out of a tin can. You've got Hetfield going for this whole kind of nu metal vibe, oftentimes just screaming in the microphone, some of which had some emotional impact, but a lot of it was just chaos between him wailing into the mic and Lars just beating the living hell out of a garbage can, or what sounded like it. And while it was a good experiment, and really good in theory, it just wasn't the Metallica that fans knew and loved. It was a band having a very public midlife crisis set to music, complete with all the emotional baggage and awkward confession. Whether it was the truth they needed at the time, or just an unfortunate lapse in judgment, St. Anger remains one of the most talked about, ridiculed, and dare we say, strangely fascinating chapters in Metallica's long storied career. And when St. Anger hit the shelves in June of 2003, it was clear that Metallica had taken a massive risk, one that paid off in chart positions, but not necessarily in hearts and minds of fans. But the album did well. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, selling 417,000 copies its first week, proving that Metallica's fan base were as loyal as ever, or at least curious enough to buy a ticket to this possible musical car crash that was going on. And the reception was anything but unanimous. Some critics loved the rawness and honesty of the record, calling it a brave departure from Metallica's normal polished sound. Rolling Stone loved it, praising it as a cathartic, aggressive return. Others were not as kind. Reviewers poured in describing the album as a noisy, self-indulgent mess, with some listeners wondering if Metallica had lost not just a bass player, but also their minds. And fans were equally as divided. But of course, with every subsequent Metallica album that was coming out, a lot of the diehards were just hoping the good old classic Metallica would come back. But by all accounts, this album was not it. And perhaps the most telling reaction came from Metallica themselves. In the years that followed, the band rarely revisited St. Anger's songs in live performances, almost as if they're trying to bury this awkward phase deep in their set lists, somewhere between Please Don't Play That and Was This a Dare? And on the rare occasions where they would play tracks like Frantic of the title track, the arrangements are often altered to sound a little less like a metal band having a nervous breakdown, and more like the classic Metallica everybody had come to know and love. Hetfield's unfiltered scream therapy lyrics were toned down a bit, and the infamous trash can snare was replaced with something that actually sounded like a snare drum. And the songs were generally retooled to fit the band's more familiar thrash metal vibe, almost as if Metallica was sheepishly admitting, okay, we might have gone a bit too far there. St. Anger ended up being less of an album and more of a snapshot, a raw, unvarnished look at a band trying desperately not to fall apart. It was a document of dysfunction, where every offbeat drum hit and every angst-ridden lyric screamed, help. And over time, St. Anger has come to symbolize Metallica's lowest point, a stark reminder that even the biggest bands can find themselves staring into the abyss, and sometimes the abyss stares right back, with a snare drum that sounds like a dumpster rolling down a hill. For a band that prided itself on precision, this was a musical equivalent of airing your dirty laundry in the middle of a sold-out stadium show. Something really weird I just found out. The most expensive guitar on Amazon is a signature guitar, and you won't believe whose signature guitar it is. I left the link below in the description. And to my subscribers, I really want to thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I truly do appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you smack that subscribe button. And while you're at it, hit the like button, join the family, and I want to thank you so much for watching.